My daughter spent all my life savings on her boyfriend and left me alone with her kids. So I gathered proof her boyfriend was a con man and brought him to justice. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Loretta Matthews, and at 67, the lines etched around my eyes and mouth weren't just from laughter, though there had been some of that in my life long ago. Mostly they were from worry. Worry for my daughter, Simone, and now a deeper, more constant worry for her two little ones, my grandbabies, Malik and Deja. My late husband, Charles, bless his soul, always said I worried too much, that my heart was too soft for its own good. He'd been gone nearly 10 years now, and the truth of his words seemed to settle heavier on my shoulders with each passing season. Simone, my only child, now 38, had a heart as big as the summer sky, but a judgment as fickle as an April breeze, especially when it came to men. There had been a string of them since her own disastrous early marriage ended, each one promising her the moon and leaving her with little more than dust and disappointment. Each time I'd been there to pick up the pieces, to soothe her tears, to help with Malik, then later with Deja, when their respective fathers proved to be fleeting shadows in their lives. My modest life savings, scraped together from years working as a seamstress in a downtown bridal shop, and then after my eyesight started to fail a bit as a part-time companion to elderly folks, was meant to be my cushion, my small claim to a peaceful if not prosperous retirement. It wasn't much, but it was all I had, a testament to a lifetime of careful budgeting and quiet dreams. So when Simone introduced me to Darius Crow, my internal alarm bells, honed by years of her romantic misadventures, began to clang with a familiar, weary rhythm. He was 42, she said, though he looked a little older, a little too polished. He was undeniably charismatic, with a smile that could charm a bird from a tree and eyes that held yours a moment too long, making you feel like the most important person in the world. He spoke of ventures, of opportunities, of a ground floor investment that was guaranteed to make them all rich, to secure a future for Simone and the children that she, and by extension I, had always dreamed of. Simone was utterly besotted. Her eyes, usually clouded with the daily struggles of a single mother, now shone with a desperate, starry-eyed adoration whenever Darius was near. She hung on his every word, laughed a little too loudly at his jokes, her usual pragmatism seemingly dissolved by his smooth talk and grand promises. Malik, at 8, was wary, his young face often mirroring the quiet concern I felt. Deja, just 6, was more easily won over by Darius's superficial charm and the small, cheap trinkets he'd occasionally bring her. "Isn't he wonderful, Mama?" Simone would gush after Darius had departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of his expensive-smelling, cologne. "He's so smart, so driven. This business thing he's working on, it's going to change everything for us. For the kids. No more struggling." I'd try to inject a note of caution. "Simone, honey, these things, they often sound too good to be true. What exactly is this business? Have you seen any actual paperwork? Met his partners?" Her face would cloud over. "Oh, Mama, don't be so negative. You always expect the worst. Darius is brilliant. He's got it all figured out. He just needs a little seed capital to get things off the ground properly. He says my small savings aren't quite enough, but if we could just add a bit more." Her eyes would then find mine, full of a hopeful, pleading intensity that always undid me. The pressure started subtly. Darius would talk in my presence about the incredible returns just around the corner, about the life-changing potential of his venture, always with a pointed glance at me when he mentioned the need for just a little more initial investment to seal the deal. Simone would then pick up the refrain, her voice full of a desperate yearning. "Oh, Mama, if only we could find a way. This could be it for us, for Malik and Deja. They could have everything they deserve. My life savings. The sum total of my 67 years of careful scrimping, of going without, of mending my own clothes until they were threadbare. It wasn't a fortune by any means, but it was my security, the small buffer between me and the cold winds of poverty I'd known too well in my youth. The thought of risking it on one of Darius Crow's glib promises filled me with a profound dread. But then I'd look at Simone, at the desperate hope in her eyes, a hope so bright it was almost painful to witness, because I feared it was so misplaced. I'd look at Malik, his young face already showing lines of worry as he watched his mother's emotional roller coaster. I'd look at Deja, her innocent trust a fragile thing. Simone was my daughter. These were my grandbabies. If there was even a sliver of a chance that this could truly give them a better life, a life free from the constant struggle Simone had always known, what kind of mother, what kind of grandmother would I be to stand in the way? Darius, sensing my hesitation, ramped up the charm, the pressure. He'd bring me small, thoughtful gifts, a bunch of my favorite daisies, a pastry from a fancy bakery. He'd talk about how much he admired my strength, my devotion to my family. He'd paint a picture of a future where Simone was happy, secure, where Malik and Deja had every opportunity. With just a little help from you, Loretta, he'd say, his voice like warm honey, we can make all of that a reality. Consider it an investment in your daughter's happiness, in your grandchildren's future. And of course, he'd add with a magnanimous smile, you'll be more than repaid many times over. The internal battle raged. My head, my years of hard-won caution screamed, no. But my heart, that soft, foolish mother's heart, ached for Simone, for the children. What if this was her one real chance? What if Darius, despite my misgivings, was genuine? The fear of her future resentment if I refused, if I was seen as the one who had stood in the way of her happiness, was a powerful persuader. Finally, after a particularly emotional plea from Simone, her face tear-streaked, her voice raw with a desperation that tore at my soul. Please, Mama, just this once, trust me, trust us. I relented. With deep misgivings that I pushed down with a physical effort, with a prayer on my lips that I wasn't making the biggest mistake of my life, I agreed. I would give them the bulk of my savings, nearly everything I had. For Simone. For Malik and Deja. For the fragile, desperate hope that this time, finally, my daughter might find her happy ending. As I signed the withdrawal slip at the bank, a cold stone of dread settled in my stomach, a premonition of a sorrow far deeper than any I had yet known. The bank teller, a young woman with kind eyes, had looked at me with a flicker of concern as I signed away the bulk of my life savings. Are you sure about this, Mrs. Matthews? She'd asked softly. I'd forced a smile, a brittle thing. It's for my daughter, dear. For her future. For my grandbabies. The words had felt like a betrayal of my own good sense, but the image of Simone's tear-streaked, pleading face was too potent to resist. Darius Crowe, when Simone later told him I'd agreed, had been effusive in his gratitude, his charismatic smile wider than ever. He'd called me a true matriarch, a woman of vision, and promised that my wise investment would yield returns beyond my wildest dreams. His words, like his expensive cologne, were intoxicating, designed to lull any lingering doubts. A week later, the day after the substantial sum had cleared into an account Darius now controlled with Simone as a co-signatory, Simone arrived at my small apartment with Malik and Deja in tow. Her face was a strange mixture of excitement and a nervous, almost furtive anxiety. Darius waited in a flashy rental car downstairs, the engine humming impatiently. Mama, Simone began, her voice a little too bright, Darius and I have to go on that business trip I told you about. To finalize everything with the investors for the new venture. It's all happening so fast. It's essential we go now. Malik, my usually observant 8-year-old grandson, looked up at his mother, his brow furrowed. But you said we were going to the park today, Mommy. Deja, just 6, clutched her worn teddy bear, her lower lip beginning to tremble. Are you going away for long? No, sweeties, Simone said, kneeling to hug them, though her gaze kept flicking towards the window, towards Darius waiting below. Just a short trip. 10 days, maybe 2 weeks at the absolute most. To get everything signed and sealed. Then when we come back, everything will be different. We'll have that new house, Malik, the one with the big yard you wanted. And Deja, honey, all the pretty dresses you can imagine. She painted a quick, dazzling picture of their new life, her words tumbling out in a rush. She turned to me, her eyes pleading for understanding, for my complicity. Mama, you don't mind looking after them, do you? Just for a little while? So important. This is our big break. My heart, already heavy with the premonition that had settled in my stomach the day I signed that withdrawal slip, sank further. A business trip? So suddenly, leaving the children? Darius hadn't mentioned this part of the plan when he was so eloquently describing the life-changing potential of my investment. Simone, this is very abrupt, I said, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. Are you sure this is wise? Leaving the children just like that? It's unavoidable, Mama, she insisted, her voice rising with a hint of desperation. Darius says the timing is critical. These investors, they're very important people. We can't mess this up. She hugged Malik and Deja again, a quick, almost frantic embrace. Be good for Grandma, my babies. Mommy will be back before you know it, and then we'll have our new life. And then she was gone. A hurried kiss on my cheek, a whispered, "Thank you, Mama, you won't regret this." And she practically fled down the stairs, leaving me standing in my doorway with two bewildered, tearful children and a silence that felt suddenly vast and ominous. The first few days were a struggle, but a familiar one. I'd cared for Malik and Deja so often over the years, stepping in whenever Simone's latest relationship imploded or her finances hit rock bottom. We settled into a routine. School runs, simple meals, bedtime stories. Malik was quiet, withdrawn, his young face often clouded with a worry that mirrored my own. Deja cried for her mother every night, her small body racked with sobs that tore at my heart. I did my best to comfort them, to create a sense of normalcy, all the while a cold dread was coiling tighter and tighter around my own spirit. Simone's promised daily calls quickly dwindled. The first few days she'd phone in the evening, her voice bright but distant, full of vague talk about successful meetings and exciting developments. She never mentioned where exactly they were, only that it was out of state. Darius never came on the line. Then the calls became sporadic, then just short, hurried texts. Everything's great. Super busy. Love you all. 10 days passed. Then 2 weeks. The absolute most she'd promised. My calls to her phone now went straight to voicemail, her mailbox full. My texts went unanswered. The small amount of cash Simone had left me for the children's expenses was nearly gone. My own meager pension wouldn't stretch to cover 3 mouths, not for long. A knot of pure terror began to form in my stomach. I tried to tell myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe they were in a place with bad reception. Maybe the business deal was more complex than they'd anticipated. But the silence, the utter lack of communication felt chillingly deliberate. It was Malik who inadvertently confirmed my worst fears. He'd been playing on an old tablet I kept for him, one still logged into Simone's rarely used social media account. "Grandma," he said one afternoon, his voice small, "Mommy posted a picture." My heart leaped. "She did? When, honey?" "Yesterday," he said, showing me the screen. It wasn't a picture of a business meeting. It was Simone and Darius beaming on a sun-drenched beach, palm trees swaying in the background, a turquoise ocean sparkling behind them. The caption read, "Living our best life. Paradise found. #blessed, #new beginnings." Paradise. While her children cried for her, while her mother worried herself sick, she was living her best life in some tropical paradise. With my money. My life savings. The tablet slipped from my numb fingers. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it left me breathless. This wasn't just an extended business trip. This was abandonment. This was theft. That evening, after the children were finally asleep, their faces tear-streaked even in slumber, I did what I should have done weeks ago. With trembling hands, I logged into my online banking. The account, the one that had held the sum total of my 67 years of careful saving, the buffer between me and destitution, was almost empty. A few $100s remained. The rest, tens of thousands, had been systematically drained in a series of large withdrawals and transfers over the past few weeks, all initiated shortly after Simone and Darius had left on their short business trip. I stared at the screen, the glowing numbers a testament to my own foolishness, my own desperate, misplaced love. My life savings were gone. My daughter had vanished, leaving her children in my care without a backward glance. And Darius Crow, the charming conman, had orchestrated it all, with my own daughter as his willing or perhaps tragically duped accomplice. The silence in my small apartment was no longer just quiet. It was the crushing, suffocating silence of utter desolation. The cold stone of dread that had settled in my stomach the day I signed that withdrawal slip had now become a jagged rock, tearing at my insides. I was 67 years old with 2 young grandchildren to raise, and the future stretched before me, a bleak, terrifying landscape of poverty and worry. My daughter hadn't just spent my savings. She had stolen my peace, my security, and a part of my very soul. The glowing numbers on my laptop screen, That pitifully small balance in my bank account became a brand on my soul. 67 years of careful living, of scrimping and saving, of going without so that my daughter Simone might have a little more, all of it gone. Vanished into the tropical paradise she and that viper, Darius Crow, were apparently enjoying, while I was left in our gray city with 2 heartbroken children and the crushing weight of their betrayal. The days that followed were a descent into a quiet, gnawing despair. My small apartment, once a haven of modest comfort, now felt like a cage. Every corner held a memory of Simone, of Malik and Deja's happier times before their mother had been stolen away by a conman's slick promises. The silence, once broken only by the gentle tick of my old mantel clock, was now filled with Deja's nighttime sobs for mommy, and Malik's increasingly withdrawn, angry silences. At 8 years old he understood more than he let on, his young eyes holding a weary knowledge that no child should possess. He'd stopped asking when his mother was coming back. Instead he'd just watch me, his gaze a mixture of worry and a heartbreaking, unspoken accusation. My meager widow's pension, barely enough for one, was now supposed to stretch to feed 3, to clothe 2 growing children, to keep the lights on and a roof over our heads. The small amount of cash Simone had left, for the kids' snacks, mama, had evaporated within days. I started a grim accounting in my old ledger. Rent due, electricity bill overdue, Malik's school trip needing payment, Deja outgrowing her only pair of decent shoes. Each entry was a fresh stab of anxiety. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, my nights spent staring at the ceiling, the numbers from my bank statement swimming before my eyes, the faces of my grandchildren, so innocent, so dependent on me, haunting my waking thoughts. How could Simone do this? How could she abandon her own children, betray her own mother for a man she barely knew? Was she truly a willing accomplice in his scheme, or was she too a victim, blinded by his charm, trapped in his web of deceit? My heart ached with this terrible uncertainty. One moment I'd be consumed by a white-hot rage at her callousness. The next, a wave of desperate fear for her safety would wash over me. Had Darius hurt her? Was she in danger? Or was she simply sunning herself on a beach somewhere, without a care in the world for the devastation she'd left behind? The physical toll of the stress, the lack of sleep, the inadequate nutrition began to show. My chronic cough, a souvenir from years spent working in dusty garment factories, worsened, each racking spasm leaving me breathless and weak. My arthritis, usually manageable with cheap liniment, flared with a vengeance, my hands gnarled and aching, making even simple tasks like buttoning Deja's coat an agony. I was 67, but I felt 100. Malik's teacher, Miss Evans, a kind young woman with concerned eyes, called me in for a meeting. "Mrs. Matthews," she began gently, "Malik, he's been very withdrawn lately. His grades are slipping. He got into a small scuffle in the playground yesterday. He told another boy his mother was on a very long holiday, and wouldn't say when she was coming back. Is everything all right at home?" I wanted to break down, to tell her everything. But the shame, the humiliation of my daughter's actions, of my own foolishness in trusting them, held me captive. "Simone, she had to go away for a while, unexpectedly," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "For work. It's been a bit of an adjustment for all of us." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. Miss Evans looked at me with an expression of profound sympathy that I found almost harder to bear than outright pity. She knew something was terribly wrong. She gave me a leaflet for a local family support center, her eyes urging me to seek help. I tucked it into my worn handbag, my cheeks burning. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of scrimping, worrying, and trying to shield Malik and Deja from the worst of my despair. I'd skip meals so they could have more. I'd turn the heating down, huddling under old blankets, to save on the electricity bill. I started visiting the local food bank, the first time with a shame so profound I could barely meet the eyes of the kind volunteers. But the children needed to eat. My pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. The loneliness was a constant companion, a cold, unwelcome guest in my small apartment. My old friends, the ones I used to meet for coffee or a game of bingo, I now avoided. What could I tell them? How could I explain the sudden disappearance of my daughter, the arrival of my grandchildren, the shadows under my eyes, the way my hands trembled when I poured tea? The truth was too humiliating, too raw. Sometimes, looking at Malik and Deja, at their innocent faces, their complete dependence on me, A fierce, protective love would surge through me, momentarily eclipsing the despair. They were all I had left. They were the reason I had to keep going to find a way through this nightmare. But then Deja would ask, her small voice full of a heartbreaking hope, "Grandma, is Mommy coming home today?" And the fragile dam of my composure would crack all over again. I felt like I was drowning slowly, inexorably, in a sea of debt, worry, and a grief so profound it had no name. My daughter, the child I had loved more than life itself, had not just stolen my savings. She had stolen my future, my peace, my very sense of self. And Darius Crow, the architect of our ruin, was out there somewhere, likely preying on his next victim, while I, Loretta Matthews, was left to pick up the shattered pieces of 3 broken lives, with nothing but my failing health and a heart full of sorrow. The weight of it all felt unbearable. The leaflet Ms. Evans, Malik's kind teacher, had pressed into my hand felt like a lead weight in my worn handbag. Family Support Network. It read with a picture of smiling, anonymous faces. For days, it lay there, a silent accusation, a path I was too ashamed, too heartbroken to tread. How could I, Loretta Matthews, who had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to manage, admit to strangers that my own daughter had plundered my life savings, abandoned her children, and left me teetering on the brink of utter destitution? The shame was a physical thing, a tight band around my chest that made it hard to breathe, harder even than my worsening cough. My days continued in their bleak, relentless cycle. Scrimping for food, juggling overdue bills, trying to offer a brave face to Malik and Deja, whose innocent questions about their mother tore at my soul. "When is Mommy coming back from her work trip, Grandma?" Deja would ask, her lower lip trembling. I'd hug her tight, murmuring vague reassurances, the lie a bitter taste on my tongue. Malik, older and more perceptive, had stopped asking. He just watched me with his father's serious eyes, his silence a heavier burden than any question. His grades, Ms. Evans had gently informed me in a follow-up call, were still suffering, and he'd become even more withdrawn. The small scuffle had apparently been him lashing out at a boy who'd innocently asked why his mom didn't come to the school fair. The breaking point, when it came, wasn't a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, soul-crushing accumulation of small miseries. It was a Tuesday, I remember, a cold, drizzly November morning. The electricity bill, stark red and final, lay on the kitchen table. The food bank had only been able to give us a small bag of bruised apples and some day-old bread that week. Deja had woken with a fever, her small body hot and listless. I had no money for a doctor, no money for medicine beyond the children's aspirin I kept for emergencies. And as I tried to coax Deja to sip some watered-down juice, Malik stood in the doorway, his face pale, his voice flat. "My shoes have holes in them, Grandma," he said, pointing to the worn-out sneakers that were his only pair. "The kids at school are laughing." Something inside me, something I thought had already died, just gave way. It wasn't anger, not then. It was a despair so profound, so absolute it felt like drowning. I looked at my grandchildren, their innocent faces shadowed with a worry no child should ever know, their futures so terribly uncertain, all because of my daughter's folly and my own misplaced trust. I thought of Simone, my beautiful, lost Simone, and a wave of agonizing, helpless love washed over me. Was she safe? Was she also suffering? Or was she truly, as the beach photo suggested, living a life of careless bliss, oblivious to the wreckage she'd left behind? The weight of it all, the poverty, the shame, the fear for the children, the gnawing uncertainty about Simone, became unbearable. I sank onto a kitchen chair, the unpaid electricity bill crinkling under my trembling hand, and for the first time in front of the children I wept. Not quiet, dignified tears, but harsh, racking sobs that tore through my frail body, the sound of a heart finally, irrevocably breaking. Malik, my serious little man, came and put his small hand on my shoulder, his touch surprisingly firm. Deja, despite her fever, crawled into my lap, her small arms wrapping around my neck. "Don't cry, Grandma," she whispered, her own voice thick with tears. "Don't cry." Their innocent comfort, their unconditional love, was both a solace and a fresh stab of pain. It was for them. It had to be for them. My pride, my shame, my reluctance to expose Simone, none of it mattered anymore compared to their well-being, their future. Later that day, after Deja's fever had subsided a little with aspirin and cool cloths, I pulled out the leaflet Ms. Evans had given me. Family Support Network. My hands were still shaking, but my resolve was hardening. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about Malik and Daisha. They deserved better than a grandmother slowly succumbing to despair and poverty. The next morning I bundled the children up, took the bus to the address on the leaflet, a small, unassuming building in a slightly better part of town. Walking through those doors was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. The waiting room was filled with other tired, worried faces. I felt exposed, a failure. But then I looked at Malik and Daisha, clinging to my hands, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and trust, and I knew I couldn't turn back. A kind-faced woman named Mrs. Davies, a social worker, listened to my story. I told her everything, the words tumbling out in a rush of grief and shame: Simone, Darius, the stolen savings, the abandoned children, my failing health, my desperate fear for our future. I didn't spare myself my own foolishness in trusting them. Mrs. Davies listened patiently, her expression compassionate, occasionally making gentle notes. She didn't judge. She didn't offer platitudes. When I finally finished, exhausted and raw, she reached across her desk and took my hand. "Loretta," she said, her voice warm, "you have been through an unimaginable ordeal. And you have been incredibly strong for Malik and Daisha. But you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. We can help." She explained the resources available: emergency financial assistance, food vouchers, counseling for the children and for me. And then she mentioned legal aid. "What your daughter and this man Darius have done," she said, her voice firming, "is not just a family matter, Loretta. It's potential financial elder abuse, fraud, and child abandonment. There are legal avenues we can explore to try and recover some of your funds, to ensure Darius Crow is stopped from harming others, and to formalize your guardianship of Malik and Daisha, which will give you access to more support for them." The thought of legal action, of police, of courts, filled me with a fresh wave of dread. Simone, my daughter. Could I truly take steps that might lead to her facing criminal charges, even if Darius was the main architect of our ruin? The maternal instinct to protect, however undeserving she might be, was still a powerful force. I don't want to hurt Simone," I whispered, the conflict tearing at me. She's lost. Confused. He manipulated her." "I understand, Loretta," Mrs. Davies said gently. "And the legal process will aim to uncover the truth of everyone's involvement. But right now our priority is you and the children. Protecting your well-being, securing their future. Sometimes holding people accountable, even those we love, is the only way to stop them from causing further harm to themselves and to others. And it's the only way to start your own healing." Her words resonated, a painful truth I couldn't deny. My reluctance was still there, a heavy stone in my heart. But looking at the leaflet for the legal aid clinic she handed me, I knew this was a path I had to consider, not for revenge, not yet, but for survival. For Malik. For Daisha. For the faint, flickering hope that some measure of justice, some small reclamation of what had been stolen, might still be possible. The first, most painful step on that long road had been taken. The decision to walk into the legal aid clinic, the leaflet Mrs. Davies had given me clutched in my trembling hand, felt like stepping off a precipice into an unknown abyss. Malik and Daisha, their small hands gripping mine, looked up at me with a mixture of fear and a child's unwavering trust. It was that trust, that innocent dependence, that propelled me forward, past the heavy oak door and into a small, cluttered office where a young lawyer named Mr. Alistair Finch listened to my story with a quiet, intense focus. Telling it again, laying bare Simone's betrayal, Darius Crow's calculated charm, the theft of my life savings, and the subsequent abandonment of my grandchildren, was like reliving the nightmare. But Mr. Finch, unlike the bank tellers or the indifferent city officials I'd vaguely imagined, didn't just offer sympathy, he offered a plan. He explained in clear, simple terms the legal avenues we could pursue: a police report for fraud and financial elder abuse against Darius, and potentially Simone if evidence showed her active, knowing complicity beyond being merely duped. He also spoke of petitioning the court for formal guardianship of Malik and Daisha, which would give me legal standing to make decisions for them and access any support services they were entitled to. The thought of Simone facing criminal charges was a fresh stab of pain. "Mr. Finch," I pleaded, "my daughter, she was always so easily led. I truly believe this Darius, he twisted her mind. Isn't there a way to focus on him, to get him to pay for what he did without destroying Simone completely?" Mr. Finch was kind but firm. "Mrs. Matthews, we will present all the facts as we uncover them. The legal system will then determine the extent of everyone's culpability. Our primary goal right now is to stop Darius Crowe from harming anyone else, to try and recover what we can of your assets. Though I must be honest, that is often very difficult in these cases, and to secure the well-being of Malik and Deja. And so the slow, arduous process of unraveling Darius Crowe's deceit began. With my hesitant permission, Mr. Finch, working alongside a weary but determined police detective named Miller, started to dig. They traced the initial transfer of my savings, a complex web of shell accounts and quick withdrawals that painted a clear picture of a practiced conman. Darius Crowe, it turned out, was not his real name. He had a string of aliases, a history of similar scams in other states, preying on vulnerable women, often those with access to family money or modest nest eggs like mine. He was a ghost, a chameleon, expert at disappearing once he'd bled his victims dry. The children, meanwhile, were my constant, heartbreaking reality. Malik, my quiet, observant grandson, started having nightmares. Deja would wake up crying for her mother, her small body trembling. The family support network arranged for them to see a child psychologist, a gentlewoman named Dr. Evans, who also offered me quiet words of support during our brief interactions. The emergency financial assistance they provided was a godsend, keeping the lights on and food on our table, but it was a temporary fix, a band-aid on a gaping wound. My own health continued its slow decline under the relentless stress. My cough was a constant companion, my arthritis a fiery torment on cold mornings. Months crawled by. Detective Miller would call occasionally with frustratingly vague updates. They'd had a lead on Darius in Arizona, then another in Florida, but he always seemed to be one step ahead. The trail of my money, my life savings, had gone cold, likely funneled into untraceable offshore accounts or squandered on his fleeting pleasures. The hope of recovering any significant portion dwindled with each passing week. Then, nearly 6 months after Simone and Darius had vanished, Detective Miller called with news that made my heart stop. They had located Simone. Not with Darius, not living a life of tropical bliss as that cruel beach photograph had suggested. She had been found alone, destitute, in a women's shelter in a small, dusty town in Nevada, picked up for shoplifting a loaf of bread. Darius Crowe had abandoned her there weeks prior, taking the last of their cash and leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a mountain of broken promises. The journey to Nevada, facilitated by a small grant from the Family Support Network and accompanied by Mrs. Davies, the kind social worker, was the longest of my life. What would I find? The daughter I remembered, or a stranger broken by a conman's cruelty? Would she be remorseful? Would she even want to see me, the mother she had so profoundly betrayed? We found Simone in a small, sterile room at the shelter. She was a shadow of her former self. Her eyes, once bright with that desperate infatuation for Darius, were dull, empty. She was thin, her clothes ragged, her spirit seemingly extinguished. When she saw me, she didn't rush into my arms with apologies. She just stared, a flicker of something, shame? Fear? Crossing her face before it settled back into a mask of weary apathy. "Mama," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I didn't know what to say. The anger, the betrayal, the months of agonizing worry and desperate struggle. It all warred with the sight of my child, so lost, so broken. "Simone," I finally managed, my own voice thick with unshed tears. "What happened? Where is he? Where is my money?" Her story, when it finally came out in disjointed, tearful fragments, was a sordid tale of Darius's escalating control, his lies, his eventual cruelty once the money began to run out. He had isolated her, turned her against me with promises of a life I was supposedly holding her back from. He'd spent my savings with reckless abandon on gambling, on other women, on fleeting luxuries. When the well ran dry and she began to question him, his charm had turned to menace. He'd left her in that desolate town without a penny, without a word. There was no grand apology to me, not then. Simone seemed too lost in her own victimhood, her own shattered illusions, to fully comprehend the devastation she had inflicted upon me, upon her own children. She spoke of Darius with a strange mixture of lingering fascination and dawning horror. She was broken, yes, but the part that ached most in my heart was the realization that her primary concern seemed to be her own suffering at his hands, with little understanding of the wreckage she had caused in ours. Mrs. Davies gently guided the conversation, explaining the legal situation, the ongoing investigation into Darius. Simone, listless and defeated, agreed to cooperate, to provide whatever information she had about his aliases, his methods, his possible whereabouts. It was a small offering, perhaps born more of a desire for revenge against him than true remorse for what she'd done to me. Bringing Simone back to our city was a complicated, painful affair. There was no joyous reunion with Malik and Daisha. They were wary of this changed, subdued mother, and she seemed almost afraid of them, of the responsibility they represented. The path ahead for her, for all of us, was shrouded in uncertainty. Darius Crowe was still out there. My savings were gone. And my daughter, the one I had sacrificed everything for, was a shattered reflection of the woman I once knew, her complicity in my ruin a truth too painful to fully confront, yet too pervasive to ignore. The justice I had so desperately sought felt like a hollow word, a distant echo in the vast, quiet landscape of our shared sorrow. Bringing Simone back to our city, or what was left of our city for me, was a journey steeped in a quiet, aching sorrow. The daughter I had found in that dusty Nevada shelter was a ghost, her spirit extinguished, her eyes holding a vacant weariness that mirrored my own, though hers was born of folly and his of betrayal. There was no joyous reunion with Malik and Daisha. My grandchildren, who had cried themselves to sleep for months asking for their mother, now looked at this subdued, unfamiliar woman with a mixture of fear and wary curiosity. Simone, in turn, seemed almost afraid of them, of the bright, innocent energy they still possessed, of the responsibility they represented, a responsibility she had so carelessly discarded. She stayed with me in my cramped, subsidized apartment, a silent, brooding presence, offering little help with the children, seemingly lost in the wreckage of her own making. Mr. Finch, my legal aid lawyer, and Detective Miller pressed on with the case against Darius Crowe, or whatever his real name was. Simone, listless and defeated, provided what information she could. Descriptions, fragmented memories of his associates, cities he'd mentioned. It wasn't much, but combined with the meticulous work Detective Miller's team had already done tracing his financial spoor across state lines, it was enough. Months later, Darius Crowe was apprehended. Not in some glamorous, far-flung paradise, but in a cheap motel in a different state, already working his charm on another unsuspecting woman. The news, when Detective Miller called to tell me, brought not a surge of triumph, but a wave of profound weariness. He was caught. The man who had orchestrated the ruin of my life, the theft of my security, the corruption of my daughter, was finally facing justice. But what justice could truly compensate for what had been lost? The trial, when it eventually happened, was a grim affair. I had to testify, to recount again the painful details of Simone's infatuation, Darius's smooth lies, the transfer of my life savings, the subsequent abandonment. Simone, looking small and broken, also testified, her voice barely a whisper, detailing how Darius had controlled her, isolated her, and ultimately left her destitute. She was portrayed by the prosecution as both a victim and a tragically misguided accomplice, her own culpability softened by Darius's clear pattern of predatory behavior. Darius Crowe was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and grand larceny. The judge, a stern-faced woman with eyes that seemed to see right through his last-minute attempts at feigned remorse, sentenced him to a lengthy prison term. A conman was off the streets. That, at least, was a small, hard piece of justice. But my money, my life savings? It was gone. Squandered. Funneled into untraceable accounts, spent on fleeting luxuries, on other women, on the ephemeral lifestyle of a practiced deceiver. The court ordered restitution, a meaningless gesture. Darius Crowe had nothing left to give but years of his life to the state. I would never see a penny of what he had stolen. Simone, due to her cooperation and her own clear victimization by Darius, avoided criminal charges, though her life was in ruins. She had no job, no money, no spirit. She lived with me and the children in my tiny apartment, a constant, silent reminder of our shared tragedy. The relationship between us was fractured, perhaps irreparably. How could I look at her without seeing the daughter who had, however blindly, facilitated the destruction of my life? How could she look at me without seeing the mother whose trust she had so catastrophically betrayed? The love was still there. A mother's love is a stubborn, resilient thing, but it was now buried under layers of pain, disappointment, and unspoken accusations. The court, recognizing Simone's instability and my unwavering devotion, granted me full legal guardianship of Malik and Daisha. This was perhaps the only true victory in this whole sorry affair. My grandchildren were safe with me. I would protect them, raise them, give them the love and stability their mother was currently incapable of providing. But the cost was immense. My retirement, the peaceful twilight years I had envisioned after a lifetime of hard work, was a distant, impossible dream. My days were now a relentless cycle of caring for two active, emotionally scarred children on a shoestring budget, my own failing health a constant gnawing worry. My cough worsened, the arthritis in my hands made even simple tasks like braiding Deja's hair an agony. The small apartment felt more cramped than ever, filled with the boisterous energy of youth and the heavy silence of 3 generations of sorrow. The justice I had sought felt like a hollow word, a distant echo in the vast, quiet landscape of our shared grief. Darius was in prison, yes, but my savings were gone. My daughter was a broken shell. And I, Loretta Matthews, was a 67-year-old woman raising her grandchildren in poverty. My own dreams for a quiet old age turned to dust. Sometimes, late at night after Malik and Deja were finally asleep, their innocent faces peaceful in the dim glow of the nightlight, I would sit by the window and look out at the uncaring city. My heart would ache with a sadness so profound it felt like a physical weight. This was not the life I had chosen. This was not the legacy I had wanted to leave. But it was my life now. And my only solace, my only reason to keep going, was the unwavering, unconditional love I felt for those 2 precious children, asleep in the next room. They were my responsibility, my burden, my last, most important reason to draw breath. My peace was not found in triumph, but in the quiet, enduring, and often heartbreaking sacrifice of a grandmother's unending love.